Your article mentions that Calloway was deeply influenced by his early experiences in the labor movement. How did his work with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters shape his later activism? You write Calloway had no patience for union leaders who ignored the plight of black workers or civil rights leaders who downplayed economic justice.
Yeah, well, actually, I'll go back further. And actually, he wasn't with the sleeping car porters. He was with another black rail union known as the Red Caps. They were like the baggage handlers. But I'll actually back up before then because Callaway comes from a coal mining family in Appalachia. And, in the South and in Appalachia, there was actually a lot of black coal miners. And his father, who was a coal miner, when he was a little kid, they moved to Jenkins, Kentucky, and that's where he kind of grew up in a coal mining town. But his father was also a miner and was a early activist in the United Mine Workers of America. And the mine workers were a very interesting union because they were an early craft union. They were one of the few of those early craft unions that actually organized a lot of black workers, and they were fairly egalitarian within the union. So, I mean, if you're talking like the 1910s, the 1920s, the mine workers of America were kind of the only interracial union that actually had like some black local officers. They would employ black union staff to help organize. If people have seen the movie Matewan, which covers the huge West Virginia coalfield battles, they didn't just put James Earl Jones in there because they wanted a black guy with a cool voice. There were actually black miners involved in that struggle. So that's kind of what he came out of. So that's what he was born into. And coal mining, you look internationally, coal miners kind of always, no matter where they're from, tend to be pretty militant. And I think that has to do with the nature of the work. It's very dangerous. It's very brutal work. It also makes very clear class lines. There's kind of no hiding it. And especially at this time, he grew up in a coal company town where everything was owned and controlled by the coal company. So the class line was always very clear to him. And again, because it was this background, he didn't have an allergy to unions. He was used to this. His father was a coal miner. Um, so that's what he came out of. And his journey, he kind of wandered around a little bit. As 1934 rolled around, 1934 was a big year for many reasons, but you're into the Depression at this point. You have three major general strikes. One in San Francisco, longshore workers, one in Toledo, one in Minneapolis with Teamsters, and all of them were led by leftists of different stripes. Whether it's Trotsky, it's communist, Socialist Party people. But these three big militant fights this year. You also had the unemployed marches growing, and these were interracial, and had black communists in leadership of that. So that was kind of a big year of like pushing the New Deal forward, and labor kind of breaking out and forcing the Roosevelt administration to kind of codify some more labor rights and open the door to more labor organizing. So he's kind of taking this all in as a young man. He gets involved a little bit in the NAACP, a little bit with the Urban League. This is the time that these black organizations start caring about labor more, and they also start seeing the opening that maybe now black workers will be allowed to be organized into these unions. So he wrote some articles for the Urban League. They set up these work councils that he got involved with, and eventually this kind of takes him to get involved in a Works Progress Administration project and an effort to organize in these WPA programs to fight discrimination. And that's kind of his window in. And I'm actually forgetting your original question. But he eventually gets into a union called the Red Caps on the rails. These were baggage handlers. So the sleeping car porters, that was A. Philip Randolph's union. Those were the luxury train cars, the staff that waited on customers. That was one of the first all black unions formed. So around the same time, you have the Red Caps, which is what Callaway gets involved with. He meets Willard Townsend, who was the president of that union in Chicago. Chicago is also where he first meets A. Philip Randolph. He meets Horace Clayton and sociologists like that. But he gets employed in the Red Caps at running their political education and their newsletter, and he kind of cuts his teeth there. But again, I actually forget your original question already.
That's fine. Pascal, do you want to
I'm
follow up?
rusty, you know.
Yeah, one of the things I find interesting about Ernest Callaway is his ability to kind of dance the dance between the civil rights movement and the labor movement. Can you explain how the Cold War had an effect on his ability to orchestrate union activity within the context of race and did not become a barrier until later on to his effectiveness as an organizer?
Yeah, and one of the reasons I like his story and I find him so fascinating. I mean, his life kind of almost
Because
perfectly.
he reminds you of you.
I mean, that would be an arrogant statement. I mean, if I could be 1/4 of him, that would be amazing. But his life kind of perfectly tracks the rise and fall of, I mean, for lack of a better term, the labor civil rights New Deal coalition. I wish there was like a better word for it, but his life really hits on every aspect of that, whether it's labor, whether it's electoral campaigns, community organizing. He touched on all of it, and like his life followed that timeline almost to a T. I mean, he retires from the Teamsters in 1973, which is almost like the year of the oil shocks. I mean, it's kind of like the dawning of the era of neoliberalism is when he kind of retires from the union. So anyway, I mean, how the Cold War. I mean, he's also interesting, kind of similar to A. Philip Randolph and many very good socialist union leaders. He early on kind of established an anti-communist outlook, and I think what people have to realize is people like that, a lot of that was fueled by what they were seeing, how communists were organizing inside the unions. I mean, the reputation was always like these people are taking their cues from Moscow. They're not really concerned about the U.S. situation. And the thing is, I mean, if World War II breaks out and their first stance was, we're going to ally with Hitler and we were not for the war, and then all of a sudden on a dime they turn and say, actually, no, we're pro-war. You kind of start to lose credibility. And there were people who felt like, when it came to black civil rights and labor, they couldn't be trusted because of these dual allegiances. So that was part of it. It's kind of a complicated thing, but he was firmly a socialist his whole life. And he always, the CIO in the 30s was a huge moment for him, as it would be for any labor activist. I mean, this is when labor broke out as a really like radical social movement. The thing is, he realized like that window closed as the Cold War started. And especially when you get laws like Taft-Hartley, which were important because they really limited the scope of what labor could do. So you couldn't do secondary boycotts, which would allow you, if there's a strike that starts one place, it could quickly explode into a bigger struggle. It kind of made labor more narrow in its scope. And, you only fight for your union, do what you can do there, but you're not going to be more expansive. So, he kind of recognized these limits when they came up. And when he moved to St. Louis in the late 1940s, he partnered with a guy named Harold Gibbons, also a fascinated person on his own. Without getting too much detour there, I mean, Gibbons was also socialist, got involved in CIO organizing. He became Jimmy Hoffa's right-hand man. He was sort of like, if there was like two angels on Jimmy Hoffa's shoulder, Harold Gibbons was like the socialist on his right-hand side, trying to kind of influence Hoffa to be more, kind of like more of a social movement type of person. But they were allies. I mean, Hoffa kind of protected Gibbons from the mob taking over the Teamsters local. So Gibbons was kind of able to carve out in St. Louis this local that was still very radical, still very militant. And they started to pioneer social programs. So they had started a health institute for their own workers. And he started getting fascinated with expanding the union's reach inside to the community. So Callaway joined him in the late 40s, and they started developing this programming together. But they were always up against these structural limits that came in during the Cold War, and they kind of stood out. There weren't many other unions in the country that went as far and as radical as they did, even though, again, the whole time they maintained they weren't a communist union per se. They didn't have communists in the leadership, but they were kind of pushing the limits of what the Cold War, post-war arrangement would allow unions to do. And I think they were kind of one of the most creative situations you could look at of social movement organizing, community organizing, civil rights organizing that's kind of led by a union. And they, this partnership with the Teamsters, and then Ernest Callaway, who had one foot into Local 688 in St. Louis, but he was also president of the St. Louis NAACP. They created this really, powerful tag team that did what not many other coalitions in other cities were able to do at the time.
Is that time over, in your opinion, as far as like being able to literally infuse labor into civil rights struggles? I mean, I know that you are a labor organizer in your real life, outside of writing these articles for Jacobin and appearing on the show, but um, are those two different things at this point?
Yeah.
Do we have to admit that there's professional activists?
Yeah, I would say the terrain is much more complicated now. I mean, I wouldn't say it's totally over, but I think it's more difficult. And I think the tasks have changed because I think in that era, I mean, I wouldn't say it was easier, but it was more clear what the tasks were. And it was more clear of like, we're fighting Jim Crow, which is enshrined in these specific laws. We're trying to fight for jobs to legally open for Black workers. All those kinds of things, the tasks were clear, even if they weren't necessarily easier to achieve. So now, I mean, I think post-civil rights is a different moment. And then it's also like you have these, I think which you were alluding to, all these nonprofits and NGOs that are supposed to represent civil rights interests in some kind of way, but don't really. Because, the other thing about that time, not only did you have labor, but organizations such as, with all of its flaws, the NAACP were actually membership organizations. These members with dues sort of thing. Same thing, I believe, with like Southern Christian Leadership Council. So I think the terrain is just much different now. And like, of course we have now the deluge of identity politics and how that is playing out, which you didn't have in the same way at this time. Again, the civil rights aims were kind of more tied to concrete material aims. The other thing too, which I kind of think more and more about, I think about this stuff actually, and it kind of might sound random, but in relation to the work of people like Anton Yeager, who talk about the decline of civil society.
Yeah.
And I think that really has an impact because, just as an example, when unions like the Teamsters in St. Louis were doing these things, they were able to organize a broader community through these civil society organizations. So, for example, when Callaway became president of the St. Louis NAACP, he led this massive recruitment drive. He was able to recruit thousands of Black people in like a matter of a year. Some of that came from the union, but also, his wife was looking at Black women's clubs and got a lot of people from there. Churches, a lot of people from there. Fraternal organizations, a lot of people from there. So they were drawing on these social networks that already existed. They were kind of there for the taking to be oriented towards politics or, working class political activity. So even now, even if you want to do that, there's just less to draw on. And I mean, it's not that there's nothing there, but you don't have you don't have an NAACP chapter with 10,000 members like you had at the time. You don't have the same amount of people going to churches. You don't have fraternal organizations that are really vibrant and active. So like they just had more to draw on to make these fights more of like a community-wide fight. So I think it's not that it's over now or there's no doing it, but I think we're almost starting from scratch in a way. We just have less to draw on in society.